Hi, today I'm going to give a stream of consciousness on what happened roughly with the block size debate and why Bitcoin is where it is today and why the forks are what they are. Initially, Bitcoin had no block size limit. The blocks, by the way, are what contain all the information about the history of Bitcoin's transactions and the creation of new Bitcoins. And ideally, in an ideal world, we would like for everyone to be able to do all the Bitcoin transactions that they wanted for next to no money possible. But even at that point, you're already compromising one element of the system because it's a deflationary currency and we need people to mine blocks to keep the network secure. The more miners there are, the more secure the network is. The miners are incentivized by the Bitcoins they get when they mine. And Bitcoin's deflation schedule, or inflation schedule, I think it's called, even though it is a deflationary currency in the long run. Bitcoin needs those miners to provide the security for the network, and those miners need a financial incentive. Every 4 years, their financial incentive in terms of new Bitcoins that are created every block halves in what's known as the halving. This is what gives Bitcoin its parabolic rises in price versus inflationary currencies like the dollar. But there is also the fees paid whenever anyone makes transactions that also go to miners. And the design of Bitcoin is supposed to be so that as the fresh Bitcoin that is rewarded to miners every time they mine a block halves every 4 years, the amount of money they receive in fees for transactions goes up, and that helps balance out along with the rise in price of Bitcoin and create a stable economic incentive that is maintainable and something we can expect to continue for decades. Which is all to say that it's a very, very helpful, the model has been very well thought out so that you can have a deflationary currency and you can have the security be provided for in a way that appeals to the self-interest of the miners. And what this means is that transaction fees are essential to Bitcoin's security in the long run, even if not in the short term. So in Bitcoin's early stages, people didn't have to pay any fees for transactions at all because the miners were getting 50 Bitcoins every time they mined a block. That's already down to 6.25. Let me just think, did I get that right? It was 50. Then in 2012, it dropped to 25. Then in 2016, it dropped to 12.5. Then in 2020, a few months ago, it dropped to 6.25. That is right. And over the years, the fees that people had to pay increased. This created somewhat of a rift within the network, but the more technically minded people understood that there was a trade-off in either direction. We didn't want people to have to use this decentralized, permissionless currency in a way where every time they'd make a transaction, it would cost them potentially hundreds or thousands of dollars because there's just so much competition for getting transactions into a 1 megabyte block. And this, some theorized, would lead to Bitcoin transactions only being processed by large institutions with lots of money, like Bitcoin exchanges or banks, essentially, and transactions being unavailable to regular people, making this was a horrible scenario to have to contend with. But the other option was making blocks larger and keeping transaction fees as low as possible so that anyone could make Bitcoin transactions. But this had a trade-off in another area which was harder to understand, which was Bitcoin security doesn't just come from the miners that you would have to outmine in order to attack the blockchain. It comes from the nodes, which can be run by anyone with a very low resource requirement. And there are hundreds of thousands of Bitcoin nodes running, and they are the ones who verify the blocks that the miners mine. So, if the miners want to play silly games or do anything like mine extra Bitcoin than they deserve or something like that, or try and double spend people, then the nodes are the people who pick up on that and reject those blocks. And that is the final security that you get in Bitcoin. They have the last say. When you make the idea of making blocks larger to make transactions cheaper was proposed as a scaling solution for Bitcoin, because it was said and estimated that you could only do about 7 transactions a second in Bitcoin, whereas networks like Visa and PayPal can do hundreds of thousands. But the point is, we're not competing with those networks because that's not what Bitcoin is. So anyway, there were 2 guys, one called Gavin Andresen, who is ostensibly Bitcoin's number 2 guy, though not really. I mean, he was the one who was left sort of with the keys after Satoshi left. But in my opinion, it's almost like Satoshi didn't want to create a godlike figure within the Bitcoin community. He certainly avoided doing that with himself by remaining anonymous and leaving. I think personally he selected the stupidest and most incompetent person currently in the community so that they could be relied upon to ruin their own reputation as quickly as possible and remove one vector for a political attack against Bitcoin, which would be to coerce the person who Satoshi handed the keys to. I mean that metaphorically, by the way. No one has the keys to Bitcoin. But Gavin had a lot of influence, and Gavin wanted to make blocks larger as soon as possible. And he had an accomplice of sorts called Mike Hearn, who was his involvement in Bitcoin was always a baffling thing, because his principles are every proposed change he tried to make to the network was something that destroyed a core value of the entire project. For example, colored coins and blacklists, where he would try to remove the fungibility and the similar the property of being digital cash. The fungibility and the property of cash in regular society being it's an abstraction of something rather than the thing itself. So if your $50 bill was stolen from a bank, or if it was perfectly legally and withdrawn from an ATM, when you spend that $50, it doesn't matter, because the actual note itself is not what you're using to purchase something. The abstraction of the abstract concept of the dollar is. That's a concept called fungibility, and it's been enshrined into law since the beginning of paper currency, because otherwise it just couldn't work. Even though there's serial numbers on dollar bills, it doesn't matter. That's very rarely used. That can be used in certain criminal investigations, but it's not so important. Bitcoin has that property. It is digital cash at the end of the day, and trying to blacklist because of the public nature of all of the transactions, when there's a bust on a darknet market and a bunch of information becomes available to the law enforcement that explains to us the history of certain bitcoins, and we can see that they've been used in certain illicit activity, trying to bake into the Bitcoin protocol itself a method of keeping track of blacklisted coins, or creating a blacklist in and of itself, creates a kind of evil ability for corrupt authorities to control a system that only works because they have no control over it. So it's a fundamental attack on the most important property of Bitcoin, or arguably one of the most, which is no one is in control of this thing, and all coins are equal. And there is no ability for any authority to say those coins are okay, those coins aren't, because then you get in a situation where people want to freshly mined coins are going to be worth more than coins that are older or that might have been through a darknet market. Really, what we want with Bitcoin is for the origin of every coin to be unknown, but somehow provably real. The reason everything is so public in Bitcoin and we have such a privacy disaster is because that's the only way to get rid of the privacy. Could only really at the beginning have been afforded by a legally private entity like a bank saying, don't worry, we won't share your financial history with anyone. We didn't want that with Bitcoin. We wanted no centralized authority. That meant all information had to be public to everyone. And at the beginning, Bitcoin was constantly referred to as anonymous, drug dealers, anonymous. But it's not anonymous. At best, it can be called pseudonymous because there's no system of identity inherent to it. You can buy them for cash or you can earn them, but at the very least, you're going to have whoever gave you your coins that you just earned. They're going to be aware of what you look like or possibly a fake name that you gave them. There's no real anonymity unless you can mine coins for yourself and do it in a way that preserves your privacy, which is possible. But it's actually quite unrealistic to do that now. And it's a very expensive way of getting hold of coins unless you have free or subsidized electricity, which is why most mining happens in areas where that is the case. So anyway, this is a very rambling history of Bitcoin, but it explains why we are where we are, and hopefully I can come full circle. So we had these two half-wits and people with very questionable motives. Mike Hearn, who I failed to mention, he also worked for GCHQ, which was one of the illegal government spy operations that was leaked by Edward Snowden. These people are someone like that. The idea that they would end up in Bitcoin it's almost impossible to believe the obvious conspiracy theories about why they might be there. Bitcoin is a libertarian and cypherpunk technology, and the cypherpunk mailing list was where Bitcoin was first ever presented to the world. And integral to the cypherpunk ideology is the use of cryptography to evade government surveillance. And GCHQ, where Mike Hearn worked, was a government counter to that, to surveil everyone as thoroughly as possible and with no regard for any sort of constitutional protections that Americans are afforded, even though GCHQ was a UK what's the word? I want to say government department, but not really. Anyway, the idea that he would be there, we can ignore that for now, but it's like bombing for peace or something, the idea. It's so counter to the ideology of why Bitcoin is the way it is and why it needed to exist. Anyway, his colored coins proposal and these various other things, they were all obvious attacks on Bitcoin. But the most effective attack he launched, along with Gavin Andreessen, was trying to make blocks larger in Bitcoin. And the reason it was so effective is because on the surface, it seems like a reasonable thing to do. And for the reasons that I explained much earlier, which is we want everyone to be able to make Bitcoin transactions for really low prices, because we want this to work as a currency and a medium of exchange globally for the world's poorest people included. We don't want to deny them access. And, there's the print, if your revolution ignores 4 billion people, it's not really a revolution. Fair enough. But what happens with that system? If you did make blocks bigger, suddenly no one can run nodes anymore. And running a node is how you keep the miners honest. And miners have all coalesced into pools. And there aren't many of them left. And the miners can collude amongst themselves to change the rules of the Bitcoin network, to maybe say, hey, we want more than 6.25 Bitcoins every block. We're going to give ourselves more. The only thing that stops them from doing that and destroying the predictable, mathematically guaranteed inflation schedule of Bitcoin that makes it something you can actually reliably store value in is that they can't do that. And the reason they can't do that is because all of the nodes that are watching everything they do would reject it if they did. And if you get your block rejected as a miner, you just wasted a lot of electricity and didn't make some Bitcoins. So they are kept ruthlessly honest. And instead of being dictators of the network, they are now employed security guards. And when the block size debate came to a head a few years later, they forgot that, and they were punished insanely badly for what they tried to do, which was an amazing story that I'll try and cover in this video. There's a lot of history here to get through. So, the movement to make blocks bigger initially was received quite well within the community. Gavin and Mike were saying some worrying things to anyone with a more idealist perspective and a real cypherpunk mentality or ideology. They were saying things like, "Oh, if Gavin's just got to be the dictator for a few weeks and say that's what's happening, guys. We're making blocks bigger. Then so be it. It's worth it." Roger Ver, who used to refer to still does refer to himself as Bitcoin Jesus, though he was an early investor in Bitcoin and a big proponent of it, went insane and joined in the big blocker group as well, and was famously said, if we run the risk of becoming PayPal 2.0, I think it's worth it. We need bigger blocks. These people just didn't really have. It was either due to questionable motives or just a lack of nuanced understanding of what makes Bitcoin resilient, that they decided we have to have bigger blocks because Bitcoin can't scale if it can only do 7 or something transactions a second. It's not going to work. One thing these people are really not understanding, first off, is that there is more to money than transacting. There is also storage of value, which is something that has been forgotten a lot because having a savings account hasn't made it a lot of sense for a long time. And the hodl meme and buying Bitcoin and doing nothing with them is doing something with them. It's saving and storing value, which is a new generation now with the hodl meme is discovering savings again. They're discovering the point of planning for the future and lowering your time preference. These are amazing things, and they haven't made sense to anyone for a long time because the government wants to stimulate the economy and keep things going, and the way you do that is by devaluing any savings they have. It punishes the middle class, but it's how you stop Great Depressions from happening, and it's what they've been doing as much as possible since 2008. Anyway, that was a little tangent. Back to the block size debate. So what happened was, back in 2015, I think it was, I finally became aware of this bubbling, soon-to-be boiling over issue in the Bitcoin community. And I listened to some podcasts and debates between the more informed engineers and these more political figures like Gavin Andreessen and Mike Hearn, who didn't really seem to have much of an understanding of it, but were very influential nonetheless. They were busy lobbying miners and various exchanges to accept something called, I think the first iteration of it was called Bitcoin XT, which was going to create 20 megabyte blocks, which was going to be an increase of from 1 megabyte to 20 megabytes, allowing 20 times the amount of data to be in each Bitcoin block. This is an insane increase that I think was initially proposed by them because they thought there would be some sort of compromise at the end of it. But here's the real crux of the issue that hopefully I can explain now. Bitcoin is a decentralized network. It's not a centralized piece of software like any other software you're probably using today, like Zoom or Skype, or it's not a company that's in control of what it is and you just download an update and that's as simple as that. It's more like a language, which means, holy, how do I say the word toaster now actually means the thing you sit in and drive to work in, which we used to call a car? How do I get that to change? You can't really. You can sort of pay a lot of money, and maybe you can bribe TV shows to start using the word a different way, and newspapers to use the word a different way, but you don't directly control the language. You just sort of try to influence people as much as possible and to create the change that you want to see. But there's no centralized control over a language. There are weak spots, like, sure, if you went and found Webster's who make a dictionary and said, okay, you're going to change the definition of these words, those are elements of centralization, but you still can't really control the words people think in their head and the associations and meanings they have with them. So upgrading, I put in quotes, upgrading Bitcoin to have larger blocks was always going to be a difficult and contentious thing to do, even if it was a great idea. So they worked incredibly hard, and they lobbied the central points within the Bitcoin network, which are the miners, who had an inflated sense of their own power back at that time, and the exchanges. And a worrying amount of people went along with it. And there were some very strange motives for that which didn't become clear for a few years. But back in 2015 was when I first became aware. I initially started as a big blocker. I thought, we're going to be in trouble. We're not going to be able to make Bitcoin transactions for a reasonable amount of money anymore. Pretty soon the blocks are going to be full, and the further and more established the network becomes, the harder it becomes to make changes to it, which is another feature of Bitcoin that means you got to get it perfect very early on, because just like with things like IPv4 and any old protocol that we've been using for a while, when it comes to the internet, which is the best way to explain it because the internet's another decentralized platform, you can't upgrade these things because you can't upgrade the core internet protocols, because that would mean everyone upgrading every device they have. And I'm referring to if you're trying to do it in a way that breaks backward compatibility. So if people have internet connected kitchen appliances and light bulbs and cars, and you want to change the internet in a way that breaks the compatibility with those old devices, good luck. I don't think you'll be able to. And doing so that means the earlier you get these changes done before more hardware is created by companies, the better, because you don't want to break compatibility. So there was a rush to make blocks bigger, because when you make blocks bigger than 1 megabyte within Bitcoin, because of an emergency rule Satoshi made to prevent a particular DDoS attack that was going on, was not done with the intention of preserving the low resource requirement to run nodes. It required breaking compatibility with all existing nodes, because we were breaking the rule that Satoshi had made that said you can't have blocks bigger than 1 megabyte. So it was going to require a lot of work to make blocks bigger, and it was going to require something called a hard fork, which is where you break an existing rule, as opposed to a soft fork where you add in an additional rule. That this is the thing, when you upgrade a network, if you want to soft fork the network, you can add in another rule, and it doesn't break backward compatibility. The good example for this is if the rules are, if someone wants to introduce a rule saying, to the group of people that want to exist obeying my new rules in Canada, on Tuesday everyone has to wear a green shirt, and the people that don't want to be part of that group can carry on wearing whatever they like on that day of the week, and the people wearing green shirts aren't breaking the rules of the people that say you can wear whatever you like. So a soft fork, you could say blocks are limited to 1 megabyte in size, but we're going to soft fork in something that makes them even smaller than that, 0.5 megabyte in size. If you were to do that, all of the nodes that have the rule can't be bigger than 1 megabyte. All of those nodes aren't bothered by the people running the new software that says they can only be 0.5 megabyte, because 0.5 megabyte is not bigger than a megabyte. It doesn't conflict with their rules at all. However, if a bunch of people are running nodes that say blocks can't be bigger than 1 megabyte, and someone comes along and says, here's a 2 megabyte block, that breaks their rule. And they either have to upgrade or upgrade in quotes, to change their software to allow something that broke a previous rule, or they do what's called fork and go off on a different network. The people that are okay with the bigger blocks have a different network, and the people that aren't okay with it, that are running the old nodes, have their network too, and that's called a hard fork, because a new rule was something that broke an old rule was introduced to the network, and the people that continued enforcing that old rule go off on they remain on the same path, and the people that broke the rule have their own new network now. That is what Bitcoin Cash is, and all of the various forks that followed after that. They were all called hard forks because they all broke existing Bitcoin rules. For a hard fork to be successful, it needs overwhelming support. And Bitcoin had a lot of proponents that wanted big blocks. And just taking a sip of coffee. A lot of people wanted big blocks for the obvious reason: we want cheap transactions. They weren't really ever capable of understanding the nuance that miners have to get paid somehow, and they get paid with transaction fees. And transaction fees come from a fundamentally limited resource within Bitcoin, which is there isn't that much block space. This was not Satoshi's intention when he designed Bitcoin, but it was an area where Satoshi was wrong. And that is a very hard thing for people to admit. And it's one of the reasons why Satoshi was so intelligent for keeping himself anonymous. Because if he was a public figure, and he remained today, regardless of what's technically best for Bitcoin, the majority of the Bitcoin community would just agree with whatever he said should happen, because that's how people work. And it turned out that this decision, when we ignored the bigger businesses in the space that were run by CEOs that had no fucking clue what they were talking about, excuse my language, like Brian Armstrong from Coinbase and Vitalik Buterin and all of these questionably motivated people, in combination with these two incompetent and also questionably motivated engineers, Gavin Andreessen and Mike Hearn, you had a lot of money and a lot of social influence pushing for bigger blocks, and a lot of ignorance on the part of the community, including myself. Because on the surface of it, big blocks really do look quite useful. But if you're not prepared to ask the question, how are miners going to get paid? And does it matter that I can run a Bitcoin node that verifies and maintains the ultimate security of the network on a $30 Raspberry Pi? Because if blocks get bigger, I stop being able to do that. I start needing a higher tier connection to the internet. I start needing a more a more impressive processor, more resources, basically. We have a hard enough time making sure there's enough nodes keeping Bitcoin network honest as it is. We don't want to make that requirement worse for them. Anyway, that trade-off was one thing that was never understood. And I listened to a podcast in June 2015 where there was an argument between Peter Todd and Gavin Andreessen. And it seemed to me that Gavin Andreessen had not considered for 1 minute the trade-offs of making Bitcoin's blocks larger. And all this is, by the way, to say that even if making blocks bigger was a good idea, it would still basically be impossible. Nonetheless, it was something we were considering, and if enough of us wanted to do it, we probably could have done it. I slowly started to consider the difference. I was very scared of the fact that transactions were going to become expensive, and Bitcoin was fundamentally having a scaling issue, because the more people used it, the more inaccessible blocks became. And we needed a scaling solution. But it was made clear to me at the time that making blocks bigger is not a scaling solution, because that's not what scaling is. Scaling is using what you have more efficiently. It's not getting more. And the analogy for that is, you don't want to put twice as many cars on the road. You want twice as many people in each car. And that's because that's an intelligent way to scale. And making blocks bigger was something akin to the foolishness of adding more and more lanes to highways in Los Angeles, and it just doesn't seem to help. And due to some sort of theory of fluid dynamics that I don't fully understand, after a while, adding more lanes to a highway makes traffic worse and not better. And things don't scale as you'd expect them to. So, and at the time, there was an incredible disrespect and a tragedy of the commons with regard to Bitcoin's the resources Bitcoin provided, namely the blockchain space. People were doing just frivolous things with it. You can batch transactions, meaning an exchange who's processing thousands of withdrawals every hour can put them all in one big transaction called a batch transaction. But instead, they were doing every single transaction individually, wasting an incredible amount of space on the blockchain. And no engineer looks at the way Bitcoin was being used back then and says, yes, let's let everyone use it as recklessly as possible and just make blocks as big as they need to be to accommodate that. And Moore's law and hand wavy things about the internet's going to get faster, hard drives are going to get bigger. Like, all of the estimates show that all of those rules are kind of stopping. We've got about as small as we can get when it comes to the atoms on a microprocessor. We need to conserve the resources and use what Bitcoin has more efficiently. We don't need to. You don't make a car drive twice the speed. That's not what you do. You don't. If your town is hopelessly clogged up, and you need some serious infrastructure overhaul, you don't double the speed limit and say that should sort it out, which is effectively what the big blockers were doing. You say, we've got to redesign this and make this so that everything's much more efficient. And there was also a bug, as a parallel to this, there was a bug called transaction malleability within Bitcoin's code. And without getting into that too much, because it's not that important, it was what Mt. Gox blamed for its eventual collapse and loss of 800,000 Bitcoins. They blamed transaction malleability, even though it was a known bug, and they didn't have to allow it to exploit them the way the hackers did. But anyway, it was very cowardly of them to blame Bitcoin for what was ultimately their mistake. But nonetheless, a lot of what Bitcoin needs to do to scale in the future requires there to be a fix for that bug. And this bug was called SegWit, and this would move the witness data outside of transactions into a segregated part of the transaction ID that gets into blocks. And this would mean that there was no malleability. You couldn't change elements of the transaction but make it effectively the same with regard to the Bitcoin's movements within the network. This would allow things like Lightning Network and other amazing scaling technologies that are now well into development and making extreme progress. The fix for transaction malleability, called SegWit, became a political football for reasons that became clear not until 2017. And was held hostage by the miners who were mistakenly given the ability to signal for the upgrade to SegWit compatible blocks. This was a really, really strange time in the Bitcoin network. So in 2015 was when people like me started paying attention and feeling like there was a real divide in the community. By 2016, I'd understood why it was that blocks needed to remain small and why it was an unfortunate trade-off, but why making them bigger, even if it was possible, would ruin other critical elements of Bitcoin's ecosystem and compromise those key characteristics of no one can censor this, no one can prevent you from running a node, no one can change the history of the blockchain, no one can collude, and there are so many amazing properties that Bitcoin has that are compromised when you make blocks recklessly big, and it's not really a scaling solution. It just sort of patches up the tires and gets you a bit further, and then you have to make them bigger again with another hard fork. This just didn't seem like an intelligent solution to me. So by 2016, I was having a lot of arguing, and I would, at this point, call it a full-time job. I was spending 16 to 20 hours a day on Reddit, on the Bitcoin forums, arguing with big blockers. And after a while, I became a ninja at it. I'd heard every argument so many times, and was starting to get really tired of it because a lot of it seemed so disingenuous, and um, and there seemed to be a lack of integrity to the side that was proposing for larger blocks, because the people that really cared about the network understood the compromise they were making by limiting the amount of transactions you can have in blocks, but they understood that it was worth it for other reasons. The big blockers never seemed to have the integrity to say, yes, it's going to make it harder to run a node. It's going to make it harder to be censorship resistant. They never seemed to acknowledge that stuff. All they ever did was freak out about the fact that about the disadvantages of keeping blocks small. What would end up happening would be that people find out that if you have a contentious proposal that requires a hard fork in Bitcoin, you're not going to get anywhere with it. You're going to end up on your own network, and it's going to be worth nothing in comparison to Bitcoin. If you have a change you want to make to Bitcoin, it needs to be a soft fork. And that's something that doesn't break compatibility with the people that aren't paying attention, because the inertia of the people that are running old nodes is something that gives a lot of power and a lot of resilience to a network. So in 2016, I would argue and argue and argue and argue, make some food, go to the gym, come back, have 100 unread messages on Reddit, respond to nearly all of them, go to bed, wake up in the morning, have a few hundred more unread messages, and this became something of a full-time job for me, arguing with these people, and it got more and more frustrating and more thankless. And at the same time, we wanted the SegWit upgrade because we wanted to be able to make bi-directional payment channels, which is what Lightning Network is. And Lightning Network's incredible because with Lightning, you can open a channel, which is one Bitcoin transaction in the blockchain, do an infinite amount of transactions within that channel, and then close it at the end if you want to, but you don't really need to. This was scaling. It was a network built on top of Bitcoin that could facilitate, rather than say crudely, hey, we can do 20 times the amount of transactions we could before the fork, and we split the network in half doing it. You're saying let's use what Bitcoin provides us in an intelligent way by building a layer on top of Bitcoin. This was obviously the smart way to do it because it's how the internet itself is structured. You have TCP/IP at the bottom, then you have HTTP, HTML, and you have more sophisticated layers on the very top. Like, people aren't writing. If you want something fancy, it's just you put your HTML tag for script in there instead, and then you can run some JavaScript on your website. And these fancier things, and okay, you've got HTML5 to play videos now, but it used to be Flash Player and all that stuff. All of these fancier things would be embedded within the more simple base layer stuff, which was deliberately simple and unscalable, but it would allow room for innovation externally. What the big blockers were trying to do was make Bitcoin do everything on the base layer, which is not realistic and not how things are traditionally done in decentralized platforms. So to continue on with this, we wanted the SegWit upgrade to allow for smart scaling, and the proposal was put forward, and overwhelmingly everyone accepted it. There seemed to be some weird opposition to it by people that at the time seemed to just be annoyed that blocks weren't going to be made bigger as soon as they wanted, and they were worried about blocks becoming full, and they were saying, we're doing the wrong thing, we need to be making blocks bigger, not SegWit. Even though SegWit was just a fix for a bug that allowed for scaling in a way that wasn't making blocks larger. That became something that caused some resent in some big blockers, but nonetheless, it seemed to overwhelmingly be a constructive upgrade that no one really had a direct issue with, only an issue with the context in which it was presented to the network. So then a very interesting thing happened. It was proposed, the upgrade was presented and deployed on the network in a way that required 95% of blocks to signal using version bits that they were ready for the upgrade to happen. And that was the way the upgrade was proposed to the network. And we assumed that the miners would all say, yeah, we're fine with SegWit, great upgrade. And the blocks that were coming in, about 30% of them flipped the version bit that said, yep, cool, let's upgrade to SegWit. And it stopped there. for about a year, and no one had any idea why. And some people assumed maybe the miners are being lazy, or maybe they're holding it hostage because they would like for big blocks to happen, which ended up being kind of the case, but even that was only what they told us. It wasn't actually what turned out to be the truth. At the end of the day, SegWit allowed blocks to be used a little more efficiently as well, which means less transaction fees for miners. Maybe that was something they didn't want. But anyway, around late 2016, early 2017, it started coming to a head. It got really ugly, and the network appeared to be tearing itself in half. And despite 2017 being Bitcoin's best year to date, price-wise, I was convinced the whole project was going to collapse at that point, because the toxicity in the community felt just horrific to deal with. And I say that hesitantly because I'm described as a toxic Bitcoin maximalist by anyone I interact with, but that's what you get with a decentralized network. There's no one else to defend it apart from people like me who passionately do so. The block size debate was absolutely all anyone could talk about, and both sides hated each other. And there was a Roger Ver, as I mentioned earlier, the guy who called himself Bitcoin Jesus at the beginning, was a staunch big blocker and was ready to become dictator of Bitcoin himself. He owned the subreddit BTC, which is Bitcoin's ticker symbol, and it became a propaganda site for large blocks. And it had hundreds of thousands of subscribers with the same 3 or 4 people making every post. And it was an obvious attempt at astroturfing, and it was embarrassing, frankly. He also owns Bitcoin.com, which is a complete scam of a website that will trick anyone that doesn't know what they're doing into buying his version of Bitcoin that is not what's considered the real version of Bitcoin. He's, to this day, incredibly emotional and butthurt about the fact that the community ignored him. But at the end of the day, he's not a developer. He's an investor that likes Bitcoin for his own conveniently libertarian views, but doesn't really understand any of the trade-offs and is too egotistical and arrogant to listen to any of the engineers that say, yeah, big blocks would be nice, but he doesn't want to hear the but. So anyway, in 2017, for some reason, Jihan Wu and Bitmain, who were running the biggest mining pool around at the time and was selling most of the miners people were buying, became an extreme proponent of hard forking to large blocks, and was refusing to integrate the SegWit upgrade into the blocks he mined, or the signaling to do so rather. And this was confusing to us because fundamentally, miners make more money when blocks are small, not big. And everything he said seemed to be more propaganda than it did to be anything to do with engineering or, reasoned arguments with, on the one hand this, on the other hand that. It was all very political, which is fair enough. You're trying to motivate people and stuff. But it turned out that his motivations were about as bad as could be expected. Or hoped for, rather. Or feared. His motivations were as awful as you could possibly fear. When Greg Maxwell discovered that the miners they produce have the design to be able to flip version bits randomly and perform no extra work when mining blocks, but give them roughly a 20% advantage in the electricity consumption they use when mining blocks. And we'd ignored a bunch of other manufacturers of miners who'd all gone out of business, like KNC Miner from Scandinavia, who said, the Chinese just seem to have some sort of advantage and we just can't figure out what it is, and went bankrupt. And this ruined a lot of the competition within the space and gave Bitmain a very powerful position, because they were basically the only people selling Bitcoin miners, and they were doing most of the mining themselves as well. This is because they were using less electricity to do what they were doing, so they could run at what looked like a loss to everyone else. And, just the same way supermarkets will sell milk and bread for 20 cents below what it cost them, but it means people go there instead of the mom and pop stores. because once you got them in the door, they'll buy everything else, and it's a loss leader, I think is the term. So the fact that he was doing this, and he was doing it secretly, would be screwed up by the SegWit upgrade, because SegWit didn't allow this grinding of version bits in order to use less electricity in a way that would mean that they could continue doing it without anyone realizing they were doing it. It still allowed it, but it would become overt instead of covert. And this is now considered a bug, and it's called ASIC boost. ASICs being the technical term for what a Bitcoin miner is, or any other device that performs computations that can only do it for one specific application. It will do it more efficiently than a general purpose CPU would, but it can only do the one thing. Bitcoin miners only mine Bitcoin, and that's why they do it so efficiently, and they're called ASICs. That means application specific integrated circuit. So he wanted to continue, along with his company, using ASIC boost, and he wanted no one to know he was doing it. And the SegWit soft fork upgrade screwed that up, which was weird, which suddenly made sense of everything, because he'd been saying big blocks, do big blocks, and that requires a hard fork, and then you can put SegWit in with the hard fork. Easy, right? And we were all saying, no, we don't want to do a hard fork because it's going to split the network in half. We want to do a soft fork, which is a graceful way to upgrade the network, which doesn't break backward compatibility. And it means if you don't pay any attention or you don't care about the SegWit upgrade, you don't need to use it. You can carry on using Bitcoin as you always have. You can integrate with the rest of the network. There will be no communication. It's like you add a word into the English language. It doesn't mean you lose the ability to speak to people that don't know that word. So this suddenly made sense of everything, and it made sense of why the SegWit upgrade wasn't being pushed by a lot of the miners. And this became, unfortunately, the political football that SegWit now meant we knew that it was being rejected by the main miner of the network, because he wanted to continue his selfish advantage that he'd obtained. And he said at the time, a bunch of, it's only natural to defend one's own self-interest, and hey, at the end of the day, Bitcoin does appeal to this Ayn Randian libertarian philosophy of appeal to people's selfishness, because it's much more reliable than appealing to their good nature and their benevolence. It was hard to argue against that, but at the same time, he was blocking an upgrade the network desperately needed, and he'd used rhetoric along with the big blockers in such a way as to harness the energy of the people that desperately wanted big blocks, and to use that energy to reject the SegWit upgrade, which wasn't a part of the block size debate in and of itself. It was an upgrade that was to do with a different element of Bitcoin, but he combined, but because it was a potential scaling solution, because it allowed Lightning Network, he tied the two things together dogmatically in a way where you had people that supported SegWit and small blocks, and you had people that rejected SegWit and wanted big blocks, even though these two things weren't directly related. But nonetheless, they are somewhat related. And in early 2017, it was really coming to a head. The price was going up and up and up, and I was sure that we were going to collapse spectacularly some point that year. I think it was around February or March that a user-activated soft fork became proposed. And that was us saying, right, we're not waiting for the miners to upgrade SegWit anymore. We're sick of this. We are going to force the upgrade ourselves as users that run nodes, because we are the final say on the network. And about 1,000 of us started running BIP 148, which said, we are going to start rejecting on August the 1st any blocks that haven't flipped the version bit that says we are upgrading to SegWit. If you don't mine a block with that, we will reject you. And we were laughed out of the building. No one took us seriously at all, and we won. And the reason we won is because soft forks are powerful, and hard forks are entirely dependent on getting everyone in agreement, which is just impossible. We forced the soft fork to happen. And we had a few devs that joined in and a few devs that were terrified of what we were doing to the network. The thing with a soft fork is, well, this is quite difficult to explain, and I'll explain it. Hopefully, I'll come back to that. But our nodes were saying, yes, if I bought a Raspberry Pi and a hard drive, cost me 100 and something. I ran my own compiled Bitcoin Core software that had that bit of extra code in it that said, yeah, you have to merge SegWit. You have to activate SegWit. Otherwise, I'm going to start rejecting your blocks on August the 1st. And that was a contentious thing. No, we should have more time. No, we should have less time. No, we shouldn't do this at all. But anyway, it became a popular thing, and it became a grassroots movement within the community to get the SegWit upgrade happening. And there was an insane amount of vitriol and anger from Jihan, and we knew now his motivation. He wanted to keep... he denied using ASIC boost, but his hardware, at the end of the day, physically had the ability to do it, and it made no sense that he wouldn't use it if he could use it, and he'd even rhetorically argued that he'd be morally justified in using it if he did, and it was clear that he was just lying. And we said, look, carry on using it, just use it out in the open, because that's, unfortunately, soft forking in SegWit destroys your ability to covertly use ASIC boost, but you can still use it overtly. You know, we're not going to be able to stop you doing that. It seemed like if he'd have just relented at that point and said, okay, I'll carry on using my advantage, I'll just have to admit that I was lying, that I wasn't using it. And I'm not sure why he didn't agree to that. But anyway, it looked like the UASF, the User Activated Soft Fork, was a fringe movement of people that were being unrealistic about what they could achieve. But we had a few devs on our side, and we had an incredibly passionate community that were all prepared. It was a game of chicken, and we were ready to die for this. And I was sure Bitcoin was going to collapse. And then something even weirder happened. A guy called Barry Silbert engineered something called the New York Agreement, which is where all of the top exchanges and all of the a lot of miners and a bunch of people that aren't engineers, that don't know anything about software development, but are very influential within the community and the ecosystem, they met in secret in a hotel room in New York and decided, all right, we're going to give you SegWit, but you're going to give us bigger blocks. It's a compromise, makes everyone happy, and fuck you if you don't like it. We run everything because we run all the exchanges, blah. Again, these people had a very inflated sense of their own power because they don't really understand yet that they're dealing with a decentralized network. And they were all about to have a very rude awakening, which was beautiful to watch, by the way, because just, you know, like hardcore mountain men like me were sitting there running full nodes on Raspberry Pis that cost us $100, and we defeated them despite all their posturing and on. So anyway, the New York Agreement became a thing, and it was them saying, and there was a lot of posturing. There was every single one of these idiots like Vinnie Lingham and Brian Armstrong and just stupid people that had a very inflated sense of their own power, said, okay, I think it was November, we are doing this. You will get your SegWit, but it's going to be done as a hard fork, and we are going to get our bigger blocks, and the whole network is just going to be happy with this, and it's a compromise, and that's what's happening. And the entire Bitcoin community, the entire like slightly technically savvy individual cypherpunk idealistic Bitcoin community said, fuck off, we are not doing this, and it's a hard fork, you cannot make us. You're going to go off on your own network if you do that. Our nodes will never accept any of the blocks that have that are bigger than 1 megabyte. We are not going to upgrade to your network. However, if you carry on running your nodes, our blocks that soft fork in SegWit will carry on accepting our blocks, because that's how soft forks work. They don't break any of your rules. You have to deliberately change your nodes to start rejecting our upgrade. Inertia was always on the side of the soft forkers, and we were the soft forkers. And getting SegWit done as a soft fork was the real touch here that saved everything. And anyway, this New York Agreement was a scary thing to be up against because all of the big players in the space supported it. And there didn't seem to be a lot we could do about it, but we carried on with and it dwarfed our user-activated soft fork, which was just a few of us in a Slack channel running nodes that said, we're not going to accept blocks that don't have soft fork SegWit in after August the 1st. We had no idea if the miners were going to actually capitulate to this. But anyway, suddenly, at the end, around the middle of July, for a bunch of reasons, miners came out with their own soft fork that said, we're going to accept Bitcoin now. And this was a weird face-saving thing they did. Because on August the 1st, we won. They signaled for SegWit. Miners completely capitulated using their own BIP 91. And it just goes to show you that it was essentially, as my friend Matthew Hayward pointed out in a Twitter thread at the time, Bitcoin users were essentially the people in charge of the network, and the Bitcoin miners were protecting the office building that we chose to do our work in, as an analogy. And those security guards said, we're going to go and guard a different building, and therefore you're going to have to work in that building, and we run this. And what became clear was, guys, if you do that, if you unionize against us and go and force a change that we don't like, we will just hire other security guards. You're not in charge of us. They didn't understand that until it was almost too late. But what eventually happened was they realized that they are not in charge of the network. They are in charge of the security of the network, but they are paid to do it in the way that we need them to do it. And if they don't do it in the way that we tell them, then they don't get paid. And people don't like working for free, especially when there's so much money on the table and they've made such large investments into being able to earn money mining Bitcoin. So Matthew's Twitter thread was perfect because it showed exactly the relationship between the Bitcoin users and the people that run full nodes and versus the miners. The miners were not in charge of the network, though they felt like they were. They were our employees, and they hadn't realized that. And the exchanges, while very powerful and influential within the ecosystem, economically very, very relevant, everything they're doing within the Bitcoin network, what happened with these guys was they realized that we are just one user of Bitcoin. That's all you are. You speak for a lot of other users, but not really. And just because Bitfinex, who turned out to be good guys actually, who actually might have saved the day single-handedly with all this, I hate to say it, but I'll get into that later. But Coinbase was the peak of all the evil that was going on with the corporate manipulation and the attempted hostile takeover of Bitcoin. If the New York Agreement guys had got their way, Bitcoin would have upgraded in a way that a few companies had told us we had to upgrade. And that would have meant now we have something that resembles a centralized currency that is run by a consortium of companies that are making decisions politically rather than based on engineering. And the project now has no resilience or ability to resist censorship or to resist changes to its inflation schedule or to resist blacklisting of coins or to create any absurd thing like, a merging of identity politics in where there's too many white men doing Bitcoin. We need to redistribute all of these socialistic tendencies that are completely at odds with the cypherpunk principles of Bitcoin. We would have opened ourselves up to all of that. And they thought companies can't help themselves. They thought, yes, Bitcoin made us rich and we are a Bitcoin buying and selling business, or we're a Bitcoin mining business. It doesn't matter. We want control over the network, even if that means the network suddenly becomes useless. They wanted control. They saw that they could gain control and they tried to take it. So anyway, when August the 1st came around, SegWit was actually primed to be activated on the network. We'd had 95% of blocks say, yes, we're going to activate SegWit in a 2-week window in one difficulty adjustment period. And that was it. We'd done it. We'd activated SegWit. And now we had the New York agreement to deal with because they were saying, yeah, you're still getting the bigger blocks, by the way. And we didn't get to have SegWit as a hard fork like we said, but we're still going to get our bigger blocks, guys. And that was going to be in November that all that would suddenly resolve itself, November of 2017. But as an aside, when the SegWit upgrade finally merged at the beginning of August, unbeknown to pretty much anyone, Roger Ver, the aforementioned Bitcoin Jesus, and Bitmain, Jihan Wu and all that, had been behind the scenes working on their own hard fork of Bitcoin that had bigger blocks straight away. And it was called Bitcoin Cash, or Bcash as I will refer to it for the rest of this video. And if you are watching this and that makes your blood boil because you are a big blocker, I'm sorry, I refuse to use the term Bitcoin Cash because the only reason you call it that is to confuse people and to associate yourself with an incredible project, which is Bitcoin, and a complete scam of a project, which is Bcash. And I refuse to associate the two and pretend that Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash have anything to do with each other in any of their principles. The only relation they have is that they once shared a UTXO set. That's it. So I cannot possibly communicate how much of a dishonest project and how much lying and straight up unethical, disgraceful behavior was used to try and push that project. But fortunately, this is Bitcoin and this is capitalism, and nothing speaks louder than markets. And Bcash has been destroyed in the market. It's almost as bad as, I think, 1.5% of the value of Bitcoin at the current time of November 2020. It had bigger blocks. I think they went straight away for 8 megabyte blocks. And it had a apparently vibrant community, but I don't believe so. The subreddit, which was BTC, rather than its own ticker, which was BCH. They never used that subreddit. They use a Bitcoin's ticker for their subreddit deliberately to confuse people and to hopefully pull in a few newbies. I mean, I don't really know what to say about that project, really. It's like, as I said, Roger Ver owned the BTC subreddit, and he also owns Bitcoin.com, and he uses both of them relentlessly to push, with a very one-sided perspective, the idea that Bitcoin is screwed without having bigger blocks, and without ever having any of the integrity to say it's a trade-off, and without also I don't know, but I mean, he's lost. Unfortunately, he lost the debate, and he's just unable to accept it, and he's become quite a sad and pathetic figure within the Bitcoin community. And it's a shame because he was a big proponent and a big help at the beginning, but his ego is so large that he can't understand that on two levels, the big blockers lost. On a practical level, which is you can't force contentious hard forks onto the Bitcoin network without ending up with two networks. And two, it's just not an engineering solution. You don't make anything better by making blocks bigger. You just delay the problem for a little bit. And you create a bunch of other unsolvable problems, which is how do we get lots of people running nodes? How do we keep resource requirements for Bitcoin low? How do we do these things? And frankly, Bitcoin sucks as a medium of exchange anyway. It's awkward and cumbersome and slow to use in a lot of ways. And the scaling solutions like Lightning were just fixing all of that. Lightning is a payment network. Bitcoin is something else. It's this incredible storage of value that is kind of annoying to use in a lot of ways, but worth it. Because, it's like if you discovered gold and no one really knew how rare this thing was yet, and you did, and you got as much of it as possible. Your concern is not, how can I divide this up and use it to buy 3 eggs tomorrow? That's not your primary concern. It's an amazing store of value, and store of value is a great property of money, not just medium of exchange. Roger didn't understand that, and most of the big blockers just thought, this is not what Bitcoin was. It's supposed to be peer-to-peer digital cash, fast payments, no one can stop you. True, it is supposed to be all that, but we were a little naive at the beginning of the creation of it, and so was Satoshi. And this is a religious disagreement at this point, and it's an appeal to the creator of the technology. And people are very hesitant to accept that Satoshi made any mistakes, and he made lots of mistakes when he designed Bitcoin. But it can't be everything. And we know what it is. And it's the world's best store of value. It makes gold look unpredictable in comparison, because they will find new lumps of gold around the earth every now and again, and that has effects on the market, and it's not great, and it's unpredictable in supply, frankly, and you can't store it easily, you can't verify it easily. There's a big cost associated with owning it. With Bitcoin, the verification is trivial, and that's what the big blockers would screw with, by the way. If you make it difficult and resource intensive to run a full node, that screws with people's ability to verify for themselves that they have the Bitcoin that they think they have when they're receiving some. That wasn't important to big blockers. Maybe some of them, in all integrity on my part, maybe some of them understood the trade-offs and just thought it was worth it. That Bitcoin's primary purpose was smoothness and cheapness of transactions, and other things are important too, but not that important, or could be fixed down the line. But frankly, when I look at the motivations of the big block proponents, I see either ignorance or I see genuine malice, or just complete selfish short-sightedness on behalf of Jihan Wu and Bitmain. I don't see anyone in that entire, or I see a bunch of hubris and ignorance from various chief executives like Brian Armstrong. I never saw anyone. The only people that actually made sense were people like Greg Maxwell and Peter Todd, who are actual core, and Luke Jr., and all these people were core contributors and actually were working on the software, and understood at an ideological level and a technical level the trade-offs of what people were proposing here. Those were the people to listen to, obviously, and they were attacked relentlessly for being compromised, but they obviously weren't. So at the end of the day, we had a fork on August the 1st, a very strange event. None of us expected it. We were celebrating SegWit. We got SegWit. Hold on, wait a minute. What's this? Bcash suddenly out of nowhere? So, this was the beauty of it. If you had Bitcoin, you also had Bcash, and there were now these two different networks. And I was still fairly sure that things were going to collapse at this point, because SegWit 2x was on the way, which was the forced big blocks in the main Bitcoin network. This was strange now, because the big blockers had divided themselves into two camps. They'd created Bcash, that was Jihan and Roger, and then you had everyone else in the space, all the other big players in the space, the exchanges and, mainly the exchanges, actually. The miners, it's unclear what was going on there exactly at that point, but the most powerful miner, Jihan, had already made his own currency. We called it China Coin, but this is Bcash, and that was it. That was the idiot container for the big blockers at that point. But SegWit 2x was still supposed to be coming, which was the proper Bitcoin with still small blocks that had just soft forked in SegWit, was supposed to suddenly be getting a forced upgrade to larger blocks in November. And this was going to be forced upon us by every single big blocker in the space, apart from Jihan Wu and Roger, who had forked off already with Bcash. And this was still me concerned that the network was going to collapse. But things were different now. The fact that, as I just mentioned, if you had Bitcoin, you also had Bcash, meant there was now a market that directly reflected what people wanted and what people had faith in long term. And this was used in an incredibly powerful way, because Bcash didn't start out at the same value as Bitcoin, and they both shot up a lot over the next few months. Bitcoin had SegWit, and the market really liked that, but Roger had a lot of money, and he had hundreds of thousands of Bitcoin. He was one of the richest people in the space because he was one of the earliest, and he made the market price of Bcash rally and rally and rally, and it was a frightening thing to watch. People like me, who were not in Bitcoin for the money, who were in it for the principles of the technology, sold our Bcash instantly, which was a nice payday. Every Bitcoin you had one Bcash too, and I would sell them, and I sold them within the first couple of days, and walked away with a lot of money for it, and felt beautiful. I felt like I finally have received something that feels like a payment for arguing with these idiots for the last 2 years. And it had been a lot of work, and as I said about an hour ago, it felt like a full-time job arguing with these morons. And the insincerity and the lack of integrity I was dealing with on a day-to-day basis with the big blockers was infuriating. But here they'd put their money where their mouth was. They'd forked off and finally done it and said, all right, we're going to just do the fork. We're going to stop arguing about it. We're going to do it on the same day that you do SegWit. And we're going to try and take advantage of any uncertainty that exists within a new upgrade being put into Bitcoin, namely SegWit, and try and maybe that's the perfect time for us to bring our hard fork into existence. Anyway, it eventually got destroyed in the marketplace, but let's focus on the remainder of 2017 because this was make or break for Bitcoin. And so what happened was they finally had the balls to do it. They did their hard fork, and Roger pumped it, and Bitmain pumped and pumped and pumped, and at some point during late October, early November, the price got as high as it could possibly get for Bcash, and a bunch of exchanges collapsed at the time. They went I think on a Korean exchange, Bcash reached about $3,000, and Bitcoin crashed from like 9, 10, 11,000 all the way down to 7,000 one Saturday night. I remember watching it, feeling like both at the same time the sky is falling, and also this will be fine. Don't pay any attention to it. And I was right to think the latter. When it reached about $3,000, I think it was $2,800 max that Bcash reached on a Korean exchange, it shut down. Suddenly the exchange just went offline, and there was also a bunch of tomfoolery or illegal behavior by Coinbase, who did something quite manipulative to the market in the way that they announced that Bcash would be listed and given the legitimacy of Bitcoin by being listed on their exchange, and it was done in such a way as to manipulate the price upwards, which was quite surprising actually, because they were still coming along with their SegWit 2x, which was supposed to be a hard fork of what was now Bitcoin. What had always been Bitcoin, but Bitcoin had already forked and become Bcash and Bitcoin, but we were getting this SegWit 2x from the New York agreement on Bitcoin, but there was already a big block version of Bitcoin. So as I was saying, they divided themselves into two. The shape of all this is quite funny, quite difficult to explain and difficult to understand, and I really hope you're with me at this point. So when before November and the fork date for SegWit 2x would come around, the block height or the fork date, when the software that started accepting bigger blocks would start allowing them. About 6 weeks before that, Bitfinex, who I'll be eternally grateful to for this, created a futures market for the fork. Because with Bcash, it came into existence out of nowhere. Jihan and Roger had been planning it, and the minute it existed, I sold them. Great. And there was an instant market reflection of what people thought about big blocks versus SegWit, and SegWit was winning. It did win, and when any time it appeared like it wasn't winning was just because of obvious. You could watch the blockchain and watch Roger move 50,000 bitcoins because we knew his addresses, and watch him sell them and use that money to buy Bcash instead, and that would be reflected in the market movements, and it still wasn't enough. He never got the price higher than Bitcoin proper. So they lost in the marketplace. But SegWit 2x was there, and the posturing was insane. They were saying this is happening, and they were doing it in no uncertain terms. They were saying you are getting big blocks in Bitcoin, whether you like it or not. And they would dismiss us. You're a small and irrelevant group of people, and your user-activated soft fork to get SegWit in back in August, that wasn't you. We decided to do that voluntarily. They whitewashed all of their behavior in the past. They'd been shitting all over SegWit as a scaling solution, and they've been dismissing it even as a bug that needed to be fixed. And when they capitulated and added SegWit, they pretended that was done voluntarily, which was crazy, and it was infuriating to us. But again, still kind of laughable, because they still hadn't eaten the humble pie they needed to eat when realizing that they were dealing with a decentralized network. So 6 weeks before the SegWit 2x upgrade, was supposed to be doing its big block part of the upgrade, SegWit having already happened due to user-activated soft fork, which demonstrated users control the network. They'd pretended that wasn't the case, and they'd said no, it was actually the big companies like us that allowed SegWit. It wasn't you. Now you're going to have your big blocks. And Bitfinex created a futures market, and they said, all right, you can put your Bitcoin in our exchange and you can split them into BT1 tokens and BT2 tokens. And BT2 tokens will reflect the big blockchain, coins on the big blockchain, and BT1 tokens will reflect Bitcoin on Bitcoin proper without big blocks. And you can sell either of them for whatever the market value becomes. And if and when the blockchain fork happens, whichever chain becomes dominant, that's the coins you'll have. So if you sell all your BT1 tokens, which are the small block futures tokens, for BT2 tokens, and the big block upgrade happens, congrats. You're back to having, very hard to explain, but you will have only one chain will exist in the future. I mean, this was the theory of it. It wasn't actually ever going to work in the way they set up. They said whichever blockchain wins in this fork war, that's the one that we will turn back into regular Bitcoin. And the other one, that's just gone. So what would happen would be if you put your Bitcoin in Bitfinex, split them into these futures tokens, and bought one that would lose this fork war, they would literally disappear and you would have nothing. I did it with my entire stash. I sold all of the BT2 tokens, which were the big blocks, futures token, and put it into BT1 tokens, which, if Bitcoin proper survived, would mean I just multiplied by my stash by a large percentage, because initially the BT2 tokens were worth about a third of what Bitcoin was worth. That was incredible. Anyone that had the guts to do this ended up making at least, around 10 to 30% extra on the Bitcoin they had for a fork that would never even exist ultimately. Because when November came around, before that, in this futures market that Bitfinex had created, the big blocker futures token got destroyed. It collapsed almost instantly because of people like me, idealists that wanted to destroy this thing with our money. We voted with our wallets and we said, this ain't Bitcoin. I'm not accepting these big blocks. Nodes are one thing, and no one can tell. There were loads of nodes running the big block fork, but they were all Amazon web servers, and they would all turn on suspiciously at the same time. There was no organic roots behind this. The only people pushing these big blocks were a few corporate executives who were very loud and influential on Twitter, but they still didn't have any control because, once again, sorry about that, my recording software cut out. Now where was I? Yeah, the market, by people like me, we had destroyed the value. So while these executives have been saying, you're getting bigger blocks, we don't care about you little people running your nodes and stuff, the rude awakening was right around the corner now, because there was a futures market for it. And so us people that were defending the network were people that had been there since the beginning. And people that have been there since the beginning who understood Bitcoin properly, they have a lot of Bitcoin, and that's a lot of financial power. And when we dumped our coins, I'm proud to say I think I was within the first 3 or 4 people that sold my BT2 tokens. It required trusting an exchange with my Bitcoins, which is never advisable, but I thought the project is dead if we don't do this. So I transferred, and I'm not going to be too magnanimous here, I was greedy. I wanted extra Bitcoins, and I could get 0.3 of a Bitcoin for every BT2 token I sold. So if you have 10 Bitcoins, you transfer them to Bitfinex, split them into BT1 tokens and BT2 tokens, sell the BT2 tokens for 0.3 each, then you suddenly have 13 BT1 tokens, which, if Bitcoin proper survives, means you have 13 Bitcoins on November the 11th, I think it was, or November 12th. So there you go. I mean, this was an estimated date because it came at a block height, not an actual time. We destroyed the market, and it was beautiful to see because all these executives suddenly just abandoned the project, and there was nothing left except an utterly incompetent developer called Jeff Garzik, who had been a joke in the community for years. He'd been a big blocker. There were troll accounts that would make him argue with himself, posting his old Bitcoin forum defense of small blocks against his current arguments of big blocks, and it was quite amusing to see how he'd flip-flopped and had sort of sold out to some extent, completely sold out, frankly. Anyway, he's the guy that the big blocking executives decided to employ to write the software for the big block part of SegWit 2x. And due to his incompetence, I'll get to that in a minute, but within I think 2 weeks before the big blocks were supposed to start, a joint statement was written by the companies that had tried to orchestrate this whole thing. That was something along the lines of, we decided not to do this, so we're not going to do this. Which was, again, a complete denial of the reality, which is, you guys can't do this. Even if you want to do it, you just can't, and we're not going to let you. And instead of saying, all right, we tried to force a change on a network that we don't actually control, I guess we're just kind of stupid, and we've kind of learned what we're dealing with now. It was still an arrogant assertion that we control the network. We decided to give you SegWit, and we decided not to give you bigger blocks, even though all these things had come from user and from user initiatives. It was users that forced SegWit in, and it was users that forced blocks, that rejected big blocks. These companies kept deciding things were going to go another way, and then saying, all right, they're not going to go another way. We've decided we're not going to do that change. They just still didn't understand fundamentally what they were doing. There was only I think 2 actual apologies from people that said, yeah, I was a fool to think I could actually force big blocks into Bitcoin against the community's intentions. And yeah, and I don't know, it was I can't remember the name of the one executive that did actually apologize. But anyway, the fork hike came, and all my coins were still sitting in Bitfinex, which is really uncomfortable. And because Jeff Garzik, in his idiocy, made an off by 1 error, I think he forgot arrays in computer science start at 0, not 1, which is a hilarious newbie mistake for him to make. The fork height was wrong, which meant that when exchanges take a snapshot of the UTXO set of Bitcoin before a fork, they need to do it at the right block height, and they did it off by 1 because the network forked 1 block too soon. So Bitfinex was left confused and unable to credit everyone with these futures tokens back into regular Bitcoin or whatever. And they said, you're going to have to wait until December 31st, because that's when the terms and conditions expire on this thing. And that meant sitting with all my coins in Bitfinex for another 6 weeks, which was just awful to have to do. But right in the middle of all the Tether FUD as well, so I was scared Bitfinex was going to collapse. But whatever. They were the people that created an economic way for us to destroy SegWit 2x before it even existed. And I'm so grateful to them for that. So at this point, a few people like me were stuck with our Bitcoins in Bitfinex. But what I ended up doing was just buying a few BT2 tokens that were worth, way under 1% of what Bitcoin was worth at that point. All the executives had abandoned the project, and there was a fatal bug in it as well. So, well, not a fatal bug, but it would just, the project hadn't been maintained properly. No one was paying attention. I bought all the BT2 tokens that I needed to pair up with my BT1 tokens to turn them back into regular Bitcoin again, and withdrew that and got all my stuff off the exchange within a few days of the failed fork. Cost me a little bit to do it, but I still made a big profit, I'm glad to say. So at this point, what did we have? We had no SegWit 2x. We had a bunch of humbled executives that were still posturing that they had some control over the network. You had a miner and Roger Ver relentlessly pushing Bcash, which was the first which was their own big fork from Bitcoin. And their coin never, after that October-November spike up to 2,800, it never got anywhere near that again, and just became this straggler that just slowly but surely loses value against Bitcoin every day, and it's 3.5 years old now, and it just continues to decrease and decrease and decrease, and it's forked over and over again because the community is defined. The community that I find that's a bit of a stretch, even saying that Bcash has a community, but the people within it, whenever they disagree, their solution is the hard fork. And when you hard fork, you end up with two networks. And there are so many versions of Bcash now that you have to ask people which one they mean when they're talking about it. Whereas Bitcoin remains Bitcoin. All it ever did was soft fork in SegWit. That's it. It never got bigger blocks. But it's now you don't have companies that are doing what they used to do. You have them using more efficient, more modern addresses that use up less space in the blockchain. You have them actually batching transactions finally. You have them using native SegWit. You have exchanges like Bitfinex, even with Lightning nodes, where you can deposit and withdraw Bitcoin from their exchange using Lightning, which means essentially no space is taken up in the blockchain whatsoever, apart from the opening and closing of the channels, but they can remain open essentially forever. So Bitcoin is scaling. And it did so in a very violent and strange way that it's very hard for people to understand that don't understand decentralized networks. And I didn't. And it took me it was a long learning process. And my main intention with this video is there's been an attempted whitewashing of all of what happened here, and an assertion by a lot of the powerful companies in the space that none of this happened, that they decided not to have big blocks, and they decided SegWit was a good upgrade. And it's not true. And it's very important that it's not true, because users control Bitcoin, and that's where it gets its power from. And it needs to never forget that. And the big blockers just didn't understand that, and they still don't understand that. Because at the end of the day, cheap transactions are nice, even if you don't need miners to have some sort of income to maintain the security of the network. I would love to not have to deal with it when I've got to send a Bitcoin transaction and the blocks are all stuffed. And if I want my transaction in the next block, I've got to pay $20, $30 worth of Bitcoin. That sucks. No one's going to say that doesn't suck. But at the end of the day, the fact that Bitcoin has that as a scarce resource, the block, as Amir Tarki said, before he went just completely, I don't know what happened to Amir, but he said years ago, the block size is an intentionally limited resource within the Bitcoin network, and people trying to degrade that are trying to destroy Bitcoin. And he was right, and he understood that years before I did. And I'm so glad that while I may have been the dumbest person in the Bitcoin room for the last 9-10 years, I'm so glad that I at least recognized that there are people that know more than me and who understand this thing properly. And I feel so sorry for the people like Roger Ver and Brian Armstrong, who are too arrogant to understand that they need to listen to those who understand this thing better than them. And Roger is in a horrible position now. He's sold so many Bitcoin trying to prop up the Bcash project, and Jihan Wu and Bitmain just fell from being the most powerful miner in the Bitcoin world to propping up this shitcoin that they still rely on every scam in the book to try and convince people it's Bitcoin proper. The Bitcoin.com to this day lists, when you go to Bitcoin.com and you try to buy Bitcoin, it will try to sell you Bcash, and it will call it Bitcoin brackets BCH, and it will call what we all call Bitcoin Core brackets BTC. Bitcoin Core is the name of one implementation of some software that can run a node. It's not a currency, and it's not a network. And this was completely disingenuous of them to do this, and borderline fraud. And I'm surprised they haven't had a class action lawsuit, because if you're an old grandma and you're trying to buy your first Bitcoin and you go on Bitcoin.com and you end up with Bcash instead of Bitcoin because of the manipulative way they've presented it, that's just disgraceful behavior. And if you need that, then you might as well admit defeat anyway. Everyone knows what Bitcoin is. And everyone knows what Bcash isn't. And that's the history of the fork war in Bitcoin. And if anyone has made it to the end of this video, I'm amazed that you have. But the one thing to understand from it is that decentralized networks can't have upgrades forced on them. If Bitcoin ever does have a hard fork, it will be because everyone agreed that it needed one. And at that point, people probably wouldn't go along with it. And the examples of things like this are like the timing issue it's going to have to fix by 2096, where there's not enough characters available for some sort of time stamping. That's a problem that's got to be fixed at some point. But it's not a contentious change, and everyone sees the purpose for it. And there's no reason to not do it. With SegWit, there was a reason to not do it. If you were a miner, and that miner was able to make big blockers think that SegWit would prevent them from getting big blocks because it was an alternative scaling solution. These were and the upgrade proposal for SegWit was handed to the miners to be activated, which gave them political power that they are not to be trusted with ever. So a bunch of mistakes were made. And now we have Taproot and Schnorr upgrades coming in, and we're wondering how to activate those. But the network will never accept presenting it to the miners for activation again. It's going to be done a different way, and it will do something that resembles UASF, which is how we ended up forcing SegWit in the ultimate way anyway. There's discussions about this, and there's trade-offs in every direction. But we will get the sensible upgrades that can be soft forked into Bitcoin. We will get them. And if there's ever a need to hard fork, and there's a pretty much unanimous agreement on what needs to be done, we will do the hard fork to upgrade Bitcoin. But it's still going to break backward compatibility with old Bitcoin devices, which in 20, 30 years, Internet of Things will be like that again. Your TV will have a Bitcoin node in it that you pay, to stream stuff directly. It's integrated within there or whatever. I'm not being so creative with that idea, but that's going to happen. And these kinds of devices, they're internet connected, but Bitcoin upgrades will never be pushed to devices the way Apple will push software updates to their thing. Bitcoin upgrades are voluntary, and they have to be. People running 7 years old version of Bitcoin Core on some old computer they have that they've even forgotten about, those people can never be kicked off the network lightly. They need to be respected, and they provide so much integrity to the network, and they are so underappreciated. Anyway, I'll leave it at that for today, and I hope that this was informative, and I hope that the lack of preparation and approaching this as a stream of consciousness instead of in a more structured, prepared way was appropriate, or understandable at least, because there is just so much history to this and so much confusion and politics and whitewashing that you have to pull in information from so many different areas to explain something like this. So in final summary, you can't force upgrades on a decentralized network. Soft forks can and that's why we have SegWit now. Anyone that didn't upgrade to a SegWit compatible node is still using Bitcoin, and they're just ignoring the fact that you can use SegWit as well. That's all. There's no element of force there. Making blocks big, you got to force people to accept blocks that they are not accepting right now. And that's what happened in Bitcoin. One last thing I'd like to say. Hopefully this really is the last thing and nothing else comes to mind. I was sure that the big blockers were going to win in November 2017. And I think if Roger and Jihan hadn't split the big blocker community by prematurely creating their own hard fork, there might have been enough energy there to make that thing more successful. And if Bitfinex hadn't created a futures market with which we could destroy the value of the big block coin before it even came into existence and before the development was finished for it, maybe big blockers would have won, and Bitcoin would now it really would be PayPal 2.0. It'd be capable of a lot more transactions a second, but every time there's a contentious change, the proposal, like, hey, let's make all the Silk Road coins blacklisted so that no one can spend them if they've been through a drug darknet market. Who do I have to deal with now to make that upgrade happen? Is it a decentralized network? Or is it Coinbase, Bitstamp, and a bunch of other exchanges that are legal entities that are right here in New York that I can just go to and say, yeah, merge this upgrade into Bitcoin now, otherwise I'm shutting your business down. We're not in that. That's what they can do with PayPal. If you try and buy cocaine using PayPal and they know about it, they are going to close your account. Not necessarily because they want to, but because they have to comply with legal regulations. That's not going to happen with Bitcoin ever, and that gives it the freedom that we need. That means the government have no direct control over the protocol, and they have no indirect control over the protocol because they can't threaten the companies that run the protocol because the companies don't run the protocol. And that's just, Bitcoin remains independent and free and beautiful for that reason. And 2017 was it. We were either going to get SegWit and be able to scale properly and resist the big blockers, or the project was fucked. And in the end, I thought the project was fucked, but because a lot of people felt like me, we didn't care about the money, we just wanted to preserve what was beautiful to us. And we did it. And now Bitcoin has SegWit, it maintains the small blocks, and it's scaling in smart ways. And we're done. We've got Taproot coming. It's an amazing thing, and we've finished it. Like, Bitcoin can ossify. It can almost ossify now. And if Bitcoin never changes again, say for maybe one hard fork 100 years from now, then I'm very happy with what it is. We've fixed the fatal bugs, and now it's a feature. The fact that if anyone ever wanted to change Bitcoin, they just wouldn't be able to, because it's just too big, and it's already proved itself over and over again that hostile takeover attempts are just impossible. I'll leave it at that. Thanks so much, guys. This has been Bitcoin Mechanic, and I hope you enjoyed this video.